do really well, or we think we do well, and I'm talking about evangelicalism in the West, of sharing the gospel, but in doing so in ways that we can see measured results pretty quickly, whether it's giving water, whether it's giving food, whether it's giving help, that kind of thing. But yet, and I've shared this kind of ad nauseum, but we don't talk about reaching Japan. And it's one of the most secular cultures in the world. How do we separate secularism and recognize it for what it is, and separate it even from the Christian faith? And I say secularism using it as a synonym for modernity. Can we do that? And, or are we stuck with it and we just have to learn to develop the language of sharing people that are trapped in it and showing them a proper theology of the body?
Since I became a Christian through apologetics, of course, I'm very big on actually using apologetics in evangelism. Addressing the culture, addressing its beliefs, and finding ways to help people see that they're wrong, that those beliefs are inadequate, that they're not good enough, they're not adequate to describe reality as we know it. And that is what Schaeffer did so well was he got inside of other worldviews, belief systems, and showed from within why they were not adequate to explain reality. And just as an example, if you're a moral relativist, you can show pretty quickly with most people that they don't actually live by their own moral relativism. They all do have moral convictions. There are things that they think are absolutely, truly wrong. All you have to ask them is there one thing you can think of that you think is really wrong? And they will think of them very quickly. So that's a way of sort of, instead of saying, well, the Bible says, you actually got inside their own relativism and showed that it doesn't work. It doesn't match their own behavior. And so that's a very simple example, but that's essentially what Schaeffer did, is show that you can't just preach Christianity at people. You have to first help them to see that their own worldview is inadequate. And that's really how, that's how Labri, that's what I learned at Labri. They quickly showed me that the various isms that I was holding, were not adequate. You have to show that before they're willing to consider an alternative. Otherwise the traditional evangelistic method was trying to show people their need in terms of sin and conviction. But you can also show need by showing them that their own worldview doesn't answer the questions of reality. That they themselves cannot live within their own worldview, so that their own worldview cannot be an adequate description of reality. So I'm really big on doing apologetics as a way of reaching out to people and helping them to see that their own worldview doesn't work, even for themselves. But I would say, I don't use the word modernity necessarily.
Okay.
Because you yourself mentioned a moment ago that a lot of people today don't care about facts.
Right.
They're postmodern.
Yeah.
They're postmodern. And especially with these moral issues that I address in Love Thy Body, the secular views are all completely postmodern. And that's one reason that Christians have had a hard time dealing with them, because we're not as familiar with postmodernism. Most of our apologetics is geared toward the modern mind. Okay, so they're addressing materialism and scientism and naturalism and even empiricism. Most of our apologetics is geared toward that form. That's modernity. Okay, that's the lower story. Those are the isms that are trying to be scientific. They all were initially inspired, and if you look at them historically, they were all initially inspired by the scientific revolution, and they all said, okay, science gives us the ultimate truth. Let's figure out what are the philosophical implications of that. So you can see that with materialism, naturalism. That they're obviously trying to say, the material world is all that exists, and we know it through science. And most of our apologetics has dealt just with the lower story, with those isms. But we've ignored the upper story. The upper story has isms like, I mentioned idealism a moment ago, philosophical idealism, which was everything's in your mind, existentialism, and now postmodernism. These are all in the upper story. And there's a label for these, by the way. The lower story is called the analytic tradition. If you've taken philosophy, you might know these analytic tradition and the continental tradition. And most of our apologists have not been dealing with the continental tradition, but it is what has permeated English, the humanities,
Mhm.
political science, the social sciences. The university today is kind of split between the natural sciences, which is still stuck in modernity, and that's important because science is still very influential in our lives today. So they're stuck in modernity, but the other half of the campus, the humanities and the social sciences, are completely taken over by postmodernism. So when you talked about, how do we craft our message, the Christian message for different audiences? That split is one of the most important splits that we need to address. We have to show that Christian truth is rich enough and multidimensional enough that it can answer questions from any of these perspectives.